Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to talk about a topic that is not well written about in the Jungian canon of literature, but is something that penetrates and moves through all of our lives.
Especially at the holidays.
Especially at the holidays, the sibling complex. And this is relevant to whether or not we were an only child or whether or not we were part of the family of 13. But there's something archetypal and universal about how people interact in this idea of being familial partners. There's a little bit of literature that's come out by analyst Laura Newton, and there's a very personal experience that the three of us have in the constellation of our own sibling feelings towards each other. And let's jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that's actually not written about very often in any kind of psychological or particularly psychoanalytic literature. I mean, the psychoanalyst did not spend much time at all talking about siblings. It was much more about parents. And I remembered, when I was a relatively new therapist, people would come in with sibling stories, and I didn't have a theoretical framework for understanding the impact of some of these experiences, both positive and sometimes quite negative. So I'm hoping we can unpack some of those today.
Yeah, I wonder if sibling relationships are kind of a derivative or an echo of parental relationships and complexes, because there's so much about the mother complex and the father complex. And we see echoes of that in sibling relationships. And of course, all siblings grow up within a parental container, whatever that is. So that may account for some of the missing emphasis in depth psychology. But of course, sibling relationships are there in fairy tales and in mythology and in the Bible.
Abundantly.
Exactly. It's all over the place. Everybody knows about Cain and Abel.
And that what marks those stories is the intensity in those relationships, that there's really rarely is there a casual sibling dynamic. But Deb, I wanted to come back to something that you had brought in. There may be some similitude between the mother-father dynamic and the sibling relationship that echoes it. But one of the things I've come to mull over in my mind is that I think that the sibling archetype is really unique from the parental archetypes, and that one of the attainments to strive for is for the siblings to be liberated from the parental paradigms and to really settle into a much more egalitarian and companionable dynamic. So when I think about, even in my own family, I'm the only boy. I have an older sister and a younger sister. My older sister took on a mothering parental role very, very quickly, although we're only a year and 3/4 apart. But that also kept her somewhat aloof in some ways from my younger sister and I, which had a much more companionable dynamic. So I think in many families, being liberated from being a substitute mother or a substitute father makes a true sibling dynamic possible.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes in families where the parents are, for whatever reason, very wounded themselves, or there's real abuse or neglect, that eldest sibling really does take on that parentified role. And boy, that has lifetime implications, for that person. I mean, I have people in my practice who fall into that category, and it has just profoundly shaped every aspect of their life, often.
And that's what I was thinking of, is how we begin there in the shadow, as it were, of our parental dynamics and relationships. And I agree that the goal is to, as ever, is to become differentiated, individuated as much as possible, and then have companioning relationships with our siblings. But in my family dynamic, I was the oldest of three. I have a younger sister and a younger brother. And I know to my core how deeply I absorbed a parental or parentified role, and it was necessary in my family because of my parents' inability to really always be guiding and containing people, and how I echoed sort of an authoritarian a dynamic. I was not always that quote good mother at all to my sibs, and that too was an echo of what was going on in the larger family framework.
And see, Deb, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily knew that about you before, but then I think, well, isn't it interesting that you went into teaching first and then became a therapist, right? So you're in professions where you're helping to and ministering to others, just as you were in your family.
Yes, and there is that sort of authoritarian reformer too, in me, which teachers get to embody. If no, you didn't do that correctly, it should be like this.
Yeah,
I think it's both that sibling relationships are what they are, just between two kids or more than two kids. And there are echoes of the parental dynamic that we inherit.
I think sometimes when there is real parental abuse, neglect, or some other significant distortion in the parent's role, we see that older sibling kind of taking that role on. But sometimes that is also a dynamic in which the siblings become very close and connected and protective of one another. And of course, a fairy tale image of that would be Hansel and Gretel, that they cling together in the face of parental neglect and abuse. And of course, Gretel is very protective of Hansel and eventually saves him and liberates them both.
And I was much moved by a more modern day novel by Frank Conroy called The Prince of Tides, where three siblings clung together and protected one another and constituted their own little threesome as a very vibrant dynamic.
And I was thinking about a famous, well-known fairy tale in Ireland called The Children of Lear.
Oh, yes.
And one of the images that's so inspiring and continues to be in the culture is all the siblings are changed into swans by the evil stepmother, and it's the older sister who spreads her wings, and all the younger siblings are shielded under her wings through years and years and years before they're finally released.
Mm-hmm.
And the image of the older sister that shields and protects is something that thrums through that culture.
So I'm thinking about how this kind of parentified sibling dynamic, usually the oldest sibling, and the clinging together in these tales, which will be in the show notes, by the way, are also related to kind of a family trauma dynamic, that when the parents, for whatever reasons, cannot be present enough or containing enough, that then children tend to develop this kind of precocious container for themselves of protectiveness and even enmeshment.
Yeah, another fairy tale that's related here is the Six Swans, which is a grim tale. And again, there's trauma right there in the beginning. The mother dies, and then the father, the king, is kind of seduced into marrying a witch who turns the brothers, the six brothers, into swans. And it's the older sister that has to go through a long, arduous process of rescuing them.
And I feel that in these stories of heroic compensations, what does get lost is the emergence of a true sibling complex, that the hero or the heroine complex takes over, the mother or father complex gets constellated, and the softer kinship libido of the union of similars, the companionability of the sibling dynamic may then emerge much later in life, or may not even emerge in the family because the trauma dynamic locks them in, and the sibling archetype finally lands in a friendship later on in life. So in that companionable dynamic, I love the etymology of the word companion. It comes from the Latin com, which means together, and panis, which means bread. So to have a companion is one who breaks bread with another. So that idea of equanimity and equality and balance in the relationship, and for me, this idea of traveling through life with an equal, with somebody whom we can divulge all of our secrets, that we don't have to hold back any of the reservoirs of knowledge inside of ourselves, and we have a absolute sense of being received, and at least the other trying to understand us. And I think that abiding goodwill is something that's unique to the sibling complex when it manifests in its best form.
And it requires a kind of basic wholeness and growth and freedom from various kinds of complexes so that siblings as adults can come together in that lovely way of companions that you described versus holdovers from childhood. That my older brother always was, difficult and domineering and so on and so forth. And that those things are what carry over into adulthood and make things like holiday dinners kind of fraught with anxiety of, oh boy, here we go. And people get anxious about it, of who will act out or project old rivalries or resentments that started many, many years ago. Oh, you were always mom's favorite. Or, I didn't get to go to take piano lessons, let's say, and you did because you were older and you got the resources I wish I'd gotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think at its best, a sibling relationship has that quality where we can kind of take it for granted. You might act with a sibling the way you would never let yourself act with a friend, and yet you know that you'll still be connected and stay in touch. And if the worst thing happened, you could go to her and she would help you out. That's a really lovely quality of a sibling relationship. That sort of sense that, even if you don't talk for a while or if you irritate each other, that that in my case, she's got your back, which I think is true. I know that's the way I feel about my sister. I think she feels that way about me too. But Deb, I think you're lifting up this other thing, which is honestly just too common, that our siblings carry these old resentments and feelings of having been wronged or cast aside somehow, that we really invest our sibling relationships with these feelings. And then it can be very difficult to stay in contact. I think a lot of people are estranged or semi-estranged from siblings, or just those relationships are so painful because they just remind us of having been perhaps not treated fairly by our parents.
Or worse, I think that in families where there's a lot of really explicit trauma, often as the siblings reach adulthood, they'll often move away and they'll move to other parts of the country. And then coming together, it's as if all the ghosts from the childhood reconstellate and begin to haunt them, whether it's in the background or actually right in the middle of the conversations. And until that's dealt with, siblings in that situation tend to really avoid coming together as a way of keeping those things at bay.
I've also seen many situations where siblings are okay, copacetic until a parent passes away. And then very, very primitive stuff comes up, and it often the proxy for it is distribution of material stuff. People, the kind of classic, the cliched fighting over the will or the china or something. But it's not really about the stuff. It's about a feeling of emotional lack.
Yes, I have seen that too, and it can be very intense and dramatic. If people have not been able to differentiate from their families enough and find the resources for their own growth and development, it then gets projected onto, the will or other sources of wealth as a proxy or a symbol for just what you were talking about of emotional satisfaction, emotional fulfillment. That if I can get more of this money, or if I get mom's china, then it will make up for an inner lack that I have been carrying all these years. And of course, it's only china, and money is a symbol for wealth, of emotional wealth, emotional resources.
Yeah, there's this beautiful documentary from the early 2000s called Winged Migration, and it's just beautiful images of birds. But if I recall, there's a scene where there are some hatchlings in a nest, and one of them, the strongest of them, just very purposefully and determinedly pushes at least one of the other ones out of the nest, and it's just brutal. And you watch that and it's like, wow, talk about archetypal. I mean, there is a way in which we do compete with our siblings for resources.
Particularly when the resources are really slim.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also think there is an archetypal reality to this. I think it's just there. And there's research that really supports that rivalry is a given among siblings, especially between brothers. And I think some of these biblical stories of Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau kind of underscore this, that it's there. It's in the field. And in the story of Cain and Abel, God prefers Abel's offering to Cain's. And why is that? Well, because that's the way it is. With Jacob and Esau, the mother, Rebekah, wants her son Jacob, who's a second son, younger son, to inherit the father's blessing and the resources there. So I think these things just sometimes are, and they happen in families.
Well, both of those stories, I think, are important because the parental figures are the ones who poison the dynamic with the children. And Jung said something very powerful, that the best gift that a parent can give to the child is to know their own unconscious material, because children are condemned to live out their parents' unlived lives. So, without even realizing it, mom is a frustrated ballerina, and all of a sudden, her daughter is 9 years old, and it's determined that she's going to go to ballet school for the next 10 years, to vicariously fill mom's fantasy. I mean, I see those stories all the time in the consulting room. Parental agendas, even unconscious agendas, can really thwart sibling relationships and burden them.
And I don't know in the story of Cain and Abel that it was so much parental agendas, but Abel offered meat, so he was a hunter. Cain offered the fruits of the field. He was the farmer. That there just are human differences between any two brothers, or a brother and sister, or sisters that in and of themselves take hold and play a part in the drama.
But the key dynamic there is that God said, what you gave me is great. What you gave me
Yes.
over there is not great.
Yes.
Like, if that hadn't been obvious, if God said you're both wonderful and talented in different
Yes.
arenas, and God loves you both equally, been a very different story.
It is true that in these situations of really poisonous sibling rivalry, there's often an antecedent in a parental attitude or communication. The parents, as Deb, as you referenced earlier, these sibling dynamics are happening within a family container, and the parents do a lot to set the tone.
Yes. What I think I'm reaching for here is that in the story of Cain and Abel, God is in that parental fatherly role. However, that underscores my point that it's archetypal.
Yes.
It was not the earthly parents so much as it is inherent archetypally.
Yeah, that, sometimes it is true that parents just have a response to one child that's different to the other child. This brings up for me the way that siblings can often carry shadow. And this is abundantly clear in fairy tales, where often there's sort of, for example, in the Cinderella tales, there's Cinderella who's pure and good and all that, and her sisters who are vain and nasty. And so we would think about that as a potential shadow dynamic. And I'll tell you that when people come in with dreams of, well, especially same-sex siblings, especially women dreaming of their sisters, I always sort of start with the question, well, is this a shadow figure? And it really most often is. And I think that siblings are natural carriers of our shadows because we do tend to get assigned roles in families. So if we're the one who is smart and obedient and pleasing, say, as the eldest sister,
that was
the younger sister, the youngest sister might be a rule breaker and a spitfire and who gets all the attention. And then in the psyche of the older sister, who wasn't allowed to be those things, those qualities that the younger sibling got to live out wind up being shadow qualities. So then that woman comes into my consulting room, 30 years later, and has maybe a difficult relationship with this sibling because there is envy that the sibling gets to be all the things that she couldn't be. And then there's the dream of the sister, and there we are. So again, siblings can be remarkable carriers of our shadow, and that is an opportunity for us.
I think when that can be brought up, Lisa, either through self-reflection or in an analysis, it can really open up a possibility for kindness and intimacy in a sibling relationship when we realize that so much of what's breaking the relationship is projecting shadow.
Yeah, it can be very healing.
I wanted to come back, Deb, to your idea of the contending brothers in mythology and religious stories. And in my practice, I was really shocked to realize the incredible amount of sadism that brothers will visit upon each other in a relationship. I never had a brother. And my sisters could be stinkers in the ways they could be. They were nothing. I mean, I got off really easy compared to some of the stuff that these boys will do to each other. Really kind of Lord of the Flies kind of savagery. But I also think that if we step back and put that on a spectrum of wrestling, and perhaps on one end, that's really tremendous sadism. But then on the other end, it's a wrestling that promotes strength in the way that, in the ancient Greek world, men of all ages were expected to wrestle. That if you were ambulatory, you were expected to go to the gymnasium and wrestle because there was something invigorating and health-giving about wrestling. And so if I step back a little bit, and I think it's unrealistic to say that brothers should never, quote unquote, wrestle with each other. But perhaps there's a way to frame that which is more life-giving. And I'm reminded of the myth of Eros and Anteros. And just briefly, Eros is the child of Ares and Venus, and he's beginning to not thrive and fail and fade. And Venus then goes to one of the mother goddesses and says, what do I need to do? And she says, you need to go back to Ares and have another child So she gives birth to another child called Anteros. Eros means love. Anteros actually means love returned. And then as the two boys are brought together, there's this playing and wrestling and hijinks that the two of them bring to each other. And when they're together, Eros, or love, begins to strengthen and grow and move into adulthood. And whenever they're separated, there's a fading back and a loss that happens. So I think in the right context and with the energy moving in the right direction, that kind of contending between brothers can actually be strengthening.
Mm-hmm. That goes for me back to what Lisa said about being able to take your siblings for granted. Eros and Anteros can take each other for granted, and if they can wrestle and connect with each other in that way, when is wrestling connection and physical connection? And when does it become ugly, even sadistic, competitive kind of relationship? But that's a great image for both brotherly love and some contention with one another that is safe. We need relationships that we can jump up and down on and know that they won't break.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. And, sibling relationships are always contentious, aren't they? I mean, at least to some degree. I mean, we've been speaking about this topic from the standpoint of someone with a sibling, but if you've parented more than one child, the chances are good that dealing with relationships between the siblings has been a significant challenge because it usually just is.
So the parents are often referees in this realm of bringing children together in the family and trying to demonstrate some rules of engagement that are civilized.
As both of you have alluded, I have had people come in where when I really look at what was kind of traumatogenic in their early life, it may have been a sibling relationship where there was just such a degree of cruelty or even, I want to say, abuse. Sometimes siblings are the perpetrators of sexual abuse. There can be just horrific evils visited upon siblings that are not kind of in the sense that you were talking about, Joseph, where it's sort of it's contentious and it's wrestling, but it's in the interest of health. Now, of course, when I see that, I always think, well, where the heck were the parents, right? So again, there's this way that ultimately this is happening within a family context and where there's real, what I would consider sibling abuse going on. Obviously, that's a parental failing perhaps that the older child is capable of such viciousness, but also that the parents didn't keep the younger child safe. But I also think that sometimes there's just something about the sibling dynamic that could potentially be so difficult that even though the parents are trying very hard, it still winds up being a real disruption in the psyche of usually the younger child.
I think it can be just as difficult for the older child who...
Deb's an oldest sibling and I'm a youngest.
And I'm the middle.
Okay. Okay, kids, let's go for it here.
That's really funny.
But I'm going back to the phrase of rules of engagement. Then what happens if there is abuse or cruelty from an older sibling to a younger one? It is parental inattentiveness, but it's also awful for the older child who gets away with unbridled aggression or sexual abuse, whatever it may be, and has to carry that kind of shame and guilt. And of course, it's awful for the younger one who has to carry a victimization.
Yeah, that's a good point, Deb. Yeah. Just wanting to go back and visit since we're here, this idea about the older child who becomes parentified. And Deb, you were sharing some of your experience, and I was saying how I've really seen how much it marks people's lives. The thing about the fairy tale I referenced, the Six Swans, is that she's not able to become a mother. She's not able to have her own children until after she rescues her brothers. She has babies, but they keep on getting taken away from her by her mother-in-law. And it's only once she's rescued her brothers that she's free from that and can then attend to her own children. And I have seen that where people in very, let's say, families where there was kind of violent abuse on the part of the parents, and the eldest child took on the role of trying to protect the younger parents. It's not that uncommon to see that that person never winds up having a family of his or her own, because it's almost like, she or he stays in the role of protector of the siblings. So it really can be a kind of lifelong sentence.
Yeah, I think that role of the protector of the siblings can be really toxic later in life. And I've seen it show up where that becomes a dominant complex. So people go into the workplace, and if they think that one of the employees is being unfairly treated, they're all of a sudden big and aggressive and confronting on behalf of other people in a way that's often exaggerated and not required. So people that get caught in that role of protecting against can often wind up being scapegoated and really marginalized later in life.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're bringing up such an important point, Joseph, of how we carry sibling dynamics and sibling complexes into the workplace. That, we're members of a department, or we're on a special project and there's a team, and that those sibling complexes get acted out and relived over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about our experience in training. I mean, it wasn't only the three of us. We were often with others as well. And I can remember sitting around that colloquium table, and the visiting analyst might, shine her light on, one of us, not me. And I would be thinking, well, I want to be recognized. I want to be seen, and it did feel very sibling-like, both in the sense of kind of vying for attention and approval, but also, of course, in terms of wanting to retain the two of you and our other friends as companions, and wanting to band together as siblings to help each other through the process.
Yeah, so all of those things are going on, of the competing for parental type attention and recognition, which is very different of that I understand you, I see you, and that feeling of being seen and recognized, mirrored, and received comes up again. It came up for us, of course, in training, but it comes up again and again and again in the workplace, in family constellations, all kinds of group situations, of how we long for that and want to be companioned by our symbolic siblings. So it's a complicated mix of emotions that I think is just inherent in sibling relationships.
I wanted to bring in something that I don't think we've touched on yet. Early in our conversation, we talked about how the early Freudians and the object relations people were much more interested in the parent-child dynamic. But Jung really moved away from that, and he was very interested in kinship libido. And he thought in many ways, intrapsychically, inside the psychological setup, kinship dynamics were probably more charged. And this comes up powerfully in his work with alchemy, that he talks about the soror mystica, or the frater mysticus. So this may sound obscure, but those of you that have read Jung, later in his life, Jung came across these incredible alchemical images and writings, and they were being translated, and von Franz was, of course, instrumental with that because she had a degree in ancient languages, and he became deeply, deeply interested And in many of the alchemical treatises, the alchemist would be going into the laboratory and would not be able to complete the work of transformation until he had his mystical sister in the laboratory with him. And that it was this union of opposites, this companionable dynamic that allowed this transformational process to occur. When Jung was talking about the work with the anima, say the inner feminine in a man, and while the inner feminine initially could show up as a mother figure and then might show up as an erotic figure, but it's when those dynamics were transcended and the inner feminine became the friend, the divine companion in the work of transformation, or the sister, is that the self could begin to emerge. So I think that the true work of the sister and the brother can be in service to the manifestation of the self. How many of us say that we can be our truer selves around our siblings when that's a really wholesome relationship?
Yeah, that's a really great thing to bring up, Joseph, because I think part of what you're lifting up, and this I see as kind of an issue in our culture, is there's a way that we want to stop at a kind of sexualized or romantic intimacy. But there are deep, deep intimacies that that transcend a kind of sexualized or romantic version. And I think that's what you're pointing at. And those can be very rich. I mean, they can be very rich emotionally, but those kinds of relationships can also be very rich creatively and spiritually as well.
I think it would be a transformation in the culture, actually, because so many opposite sex work relationships between men and women are fraught with either parental dynamics or sexual dynamics. And all of that kind of crashing together could be resolved if the sibling, if the kinship archetype would be able to gain more ground in many of these relationships.
When we feel this deep, deep intimacy and connection, I think we have a cultural bias to think, oh, it must be, we want to kind of bring it down into a romantic and perhaps even concretely sexual relationship. But sometimes that deep, deep intimacy and connection, it could have another box, right? We could be there and enjoy it and profit from it, and it could enrich us without us having to think of it in terms of romantic or sexual relationship.
Or even feel that, not even just thinking about it. But I think that the kinship libido, for a woman to become, for a man, the soror mystica, is to really be liberated from the searching for a mother or a lover, but really becomes a true companion in a creative endeavor, which might be the building of a business or some other substantial outcome that they're looking for.
It's a really lovely image of how a brother-sister sibling relationship can become so fulsome, mutually inspiring. There's a book called Lab Girl, and it's a memoir, real page turner. And she has a work and friend, brother, companion, not a biological sibling, but it illustrates the closeness, the mutual inspiration, the friendship, and the respect for one another as other. That they have together. It's a beautiful real world illustration of what you're talking about. If we can really see an opposite sex person as unique and other and separate, and honor that sibling archetype holds such potential for our own individuation.
And that breaking bread can be enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's that kinship libido that you're describing, Joseph, that typifies the transference in an analytic relationship. So sometimes what gets constellated in the consulting room is sort of a parental figure. So the analyst is either kind of the mother or the father. Sometimes there's a real kind of erotic transference that develops where it feels like a kind of love relationship. But a lot of times, too, there is this kinship transference that happens where it feels like we're breaking metaphorical analytic bread together and we're companions on the, Analysand's individuation journey.
Yep. It seems to me that the heart of this is the ability to withdraw one's projections, either romantic or idealization, or the other person as our own disowned shadow in some of its aspects, and to withdraw all that so that you are simply you and I am simply me, and we can break bread together.
And then in the midst of that individuation, what also I think needs to be recognized is there is a kind of attachment to each other, or else we're just moving into being strangers. So being liberated from those things, something else either does or doesn't constellate, which is another kind of bond, which holds people together. And this can happen much later in life. I was reflecting as we were talking about this earlier on the fact that I had no brothers and I only had two sisters, and my father was away at work and I was raised by my mother. So really I was raised in a house full of women. So it was very easy, from the beginning of just going to school by first and second grade, women were very familiar to me, female friends, that other men seemed much stranger to me. And the fraternity of men seemed very mysterious. And it was much, much later in my life that the archetype of the brother began to constellate in my soul. And I began to really feel deeply and heartfully connected to other men and men in my practice. And that has been an enormous joy and discovery later in my life.
And I might add on a similarly personal note of having a younger sister and a cousin who lived in the same town who was also female, of that the archetype of sisterhood has run strongly through my life. I went to a women's college. I've been in women's groups, and that has been a source of enrichment and inspiration and simply delight and joy that has been a thread running through my life. It's been a sustaining theme of these sibling relationships and sibling imagery and archetypes can be huge for us and such sources of enlivenment and support.
And I'm just thinking how our trio here really typifies a lot of what we've been talking about. That I think we have that kinship libido, the three of us, we are a sibling bunch, and we do squabble sometimes.
Yeah, we were sort of all raised together in our training family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Me too. And we wrestle to build strength sometimes, and we laugh to transcend tensions and share insights. I mean, all of those wonderful positive sibling dynamics.
Yeah, and it does feel like I can take you guys for granted a little bit. I can show you my worst self, and you'll still take my phone call the next day.
Yes, we are and have seen our one another's shadows, and I think what we know in the taking each other for granted is that we won't break. We can jump up and down on the relationship and it will still be there. I don't take you for granted in a personal sense, but I take the strength of our relational foundation for granted.
And I think that phrase, taking for granted, is complicated. It's an ambivalent phrase. What I'd like to do is offer another way of saying it is that you trust.
Yes, that's better.
I think that actually is a little clearer.
Yes.
You trust the relationship. We trust each other.
It's going to be there.
Yes, and even if one or the other of us, or me more frequently, screws up, um, that that there's always a way back. That there's always a way back.
Yeah.
And to trust that, that's a real bond.
That's a lovely sort of happily ever after, isn't it? And with that, perhaps we can segue into the dream for this week. Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work, but producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
Today's dream comes from a woman who's 32 years old, and she works as an archivist. And here's the dream. She says, I visited a pet shop to buy a snake. I had a dog with me. I looked around the store and couldn't find any reptiles. So I asked the staff, and one of the employees told me they kept them in a separate room. He had no face and reminded me of a jailer as he carried a bunch of keys with him. The old wooden door we approached didn't match the rest of the store, which was very modern, friendly, and light. As he unlocked the door, my dog tried to get in with us, but I told her to wait outside. The room on the other side seemed to have no ceiling or visible end and was more like a dungeon or cave. On the right side from the door, there was a wooden outdoor rabbit cage with 6 compartments. It was too dark to see the animals, but I could hear some sizzling and strangely humming noises and saw that all of their skins had different patterns in black and white. The man asked me if I wanted to hold one, and before I could say anything, he opened one of the boxes and gave me a smaller snake. It felt warm and lively in my hands, and I enjoyed holding it. I couldn't see its head, so I tried to get a closer look, and as I held it closer, so my face, it started biting my hand a couple of times, though it didn't really hurt, and even if it did strike before every bite, they felt more like it was just nibbling a bit. The man asked me if I was okay, and I laughed and told him I was not afraid of snakes. I handed it back to him and decided that I didn't really need a snake as a pet. As I opened the door to get back, my dog was excited to see me, and I petted her for a while at the threshold. Through the open door, some bright light fell on the cage, and I looked back and finally got a closer look at the snakes. They were all sleeping and still making humming sounds, rolled up as snakes do, but their heads looked like those of rabbits with no ears. And for context, she says, I'm making progress in psychotherapy, realizing that I had some problems with codependency in my previous relationships. I broke up with my girlfriend about 2 months ago, and I'm starting to forgive her and myself. And as to the main feelings, she says, I could strongly feel that I was not afraid and felt rather assertive and curious. There was also a strong feeling of love for my dog. And finally, she offers this. She says, I traveled to Australia 2 years ago and got fascinated with snakes. I also held a couple of them, and even if I still find them so interesting and cool, I wouldn't want to have one as a pet.
So it sounds like the arc of transformation in the dream goes from she wants to buy a snake, she has an encounter with snakes, and then the attitude changes and she realizes, no, I don't really want a snake as a pet. So there's kind of a beginning and then a lysis, which is rather kind of tidy. And I can imagine that this encounter with the snake and the symbol of the snake kind of educates the soul in some way which is sufficient.
Yeah, just knowing that she could hold it, that she wasn't afraid of it, to have an encounter with it was enough.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really interesting that she chose to leave the dog outside the door. And the reason I was thinking that is the guy with the keys reminded me of a psychopomp, a kind of a person who allows you into the underworld. And
Yes.
often in ancient mythology, the dog would come with you because in the pitch darkness of the underworld, you kind of need something to sniff you through the environment. But somehow the ego says, no, you're going to stay out. And the ego needs to kind of contend by itself or trust the psychopomp that it's just going to have the experience it needs. And thankfully, it does turn out okay.
And this, what we're calling the psychopomp, or the guide to the underworld, the one who helps us traverse the realms, starts out being perceived as a jailer. He has no face and feels to the dream ego, kind of ominous. A jailer would not be somebody you have warm feelings toward. And then he becomes, really very helpful. He offers her to hold, it seems like he offers her to hold a rabbit, but then he hands her a smaller snake that feels warm and lively in my hands, and she enjoyed holding it. Then he asks if she's okay. Originally sort of a foreboding jailer figure becomes a real helpful guide. And at the end, she reunites with her dog, which, of course, the dogs are highly relational. They're mammals. Snakes are not. They're reptiles. So she kind of goes full circle and comes back to the creature, her instinctive or soul animal. She comes back with a renewed sense of connection and appreciation, leaving the snakes charmingly. The snakes are all sleeping and making humming sounds. And they look like rabbits. Their heads look like rabbits with no ears, which is also very nice. It's a warmer, more cuddly kind of image.
Well, I mean, the snakes are kind of cuddly in a way from the beginning, right? Because they're warm and they're in a rabbit.
Mm-hmm.
They're in a rabbit hutch. I think it's interesting that there are 6 compartments, and 6 is a number that's associated with equilibrium and harmony. But so somehow this dreamer goes into this pet shop with the intention of wanting a snake, then encounters this psychopomp, this guide, who's ambivalent. I mean, this is an ambivalent figure with no face and this sort of ominous ring of keys, and guides her across the threshold. I mean, I think that the keys is an interesting image because somehow this is an element of the psyche that has access to the depths. And we know that this is an encounter into an older, darker place in the psyche because it's got this ancient door, which is very much different than the rest of the shop. So this is a movement into an older layer of the psyche where there is a different kind of instinctual energy than the dog. I mean, snakes obviously are a powerful, powerful symbol that Jung said were associated with kind of instinctual kind of life processes like the parasympathetic nervous system and that kind of thing.
And they also carry a real sort of spiritual valence.
Yes, they do.
As snakes shed their skin and seem to sort of regenerate. And it was for Jung, and I think just is embedded in the image of both of those incredible polarities of snakes as base, instinctual, cold-blooded, but grounded animals with no legs, and then the spiritual aspect of snake. And there's been snake worship throughout history. So it's a very powerful image.
It's really a lovely dream, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It feels wonderfully contained, even though it's a little spooky. It's also interesting that the psychopomp is the one who grants access and then locks it back up. So whatever the snakes represent, at least at the beginning of the dream, there's a feeling that it has to be really contained, that the ego needs a very titrated access to it. So it might suggest that there's a capacity to be overwhelmed if there's too much access to it. And then often, as happens in an analysis, that the analysand brushes up against something that's really potent, and then they have to step away. And then they come back and revisit it later on. And in each of the visiting, there's another kind of quantity of libido, quantity of energy that becomes accessible. But it's nice where things can kind of be put away and opened up again. And it's really wonderful to see this self-regulating system alive and well in her psyche.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in this kind of conflation of rabbits and snakes.
Yes, me too. I was just going to say that because these are not really snakes; they're rabbit snakes.
They're rabbit snakes,
and they're warm-blooded.
Yeah, they're warm in her hands. They cuddle up together at the end, and they have heads that look like rabbits.
And they're in a rabbit hutch.
And exactly.
So rabbits are lunar animals, and they're associated with the mother goddess in many cultures.
So there is that, but also I just want to say that there's a cultural reference to. I don't know if any of you saw The Never-Ending Story.
Oh yes, ages ago,
right? And the dragon, whose name is Falkor, is a serpentine dragon with the face of a puppy. So there's something already in the collective, and very possibly something she had viewed, which makes the dragon seem unbelievably sympathetic and cuddly and really appealing, where I think a dragon with a reptile face would be much more difficult to love.
Yeah, well, there's something that's, I mean, reptiles are not, relational. They're just not, like your dog loves you and recognizes you and knows when you walk in the door as opposed to a stranger. And, if anyone's ever kept a snake, I mean, I don't know that, I don't know that snakes, they're these stories of, people having large constrictors and walking in with a bag full of fried chicken, and then they're found dead because the snake smells the fried chicken and just kills you. So, I don't think snakes are like, oh, hi, glad you're home, the way that a dog or even a cat would. They're just not relational animals.
But the snake becomes puppy-like because it's actually teething on her.
Yeah,
like a puppy.
It's a kind of
and
nipping.
she calls it an earless rabbit, but I could easily see them as puppy heads.
Well, yeah. I can certainly say from experience that snakes are not relational, as in not at all.
I don't want to offend any snake lovers among our listenership.
Part of my family history is my sister's herpetology passion. Yeah. So we had all kinds of snakes and other amphibians. But what I'm thinking about in this dream is that it feels like the rabbit image bridges the symbolism of reptile, snake, cold-blooded, non-relational with something that is warm and cuddly.
Well, there's the dog energy.
And the dog energy. And it is a sweet image of the snake is kind of teething on her. Mm-hmm. So it feels like rabbit is a way of joining those two realms symbolically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is some very deep content, but it's not that deep. And she can have access to it. And it also is, I think, sort of safely and appropriately locked away as well.
Also, at the end, I like the lysis of this dream very much because it feels like all of this is brought into consciousness because she says the open door. So now the door is open.
Yes.
Bright light falls on the cage,
yes.
And she gets to get a really closer look at the snakes.
Yeah, so you're right. There's some consciousness being brought to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And she can look at it of that more objective stance of really seeing, and seeing is often a symbol for understanding and integration of something.
So the mystery in terms of venturing an interpretation would be, what do these snakes mean in her psychological setup, in her personal mythology? What could we make of that? And snakes can be initiatory, right? The snake in the Garden of Eden introduces Adam and Eve to a whole new state of consciousness, which of course brings a whole new state of troubles to them.
Snakes can be about healing,
They're
as they were in the Asclepian cult.
Often in Jungian training, that one was thought to need a serpent dream to kind of signal that you were really in the training. And they began to see this very frequently. People would dream of getting bit by a snake and injected with a poison. And in that realm, the poison would be the interpretation that nobody wants to hear because it's really painful, but it actually is in fact the medicine that one needs to begin to be on this journey of self-knowledge.
Yeah, so she's perhaps been not quite fully initiated because she doesn't wind up, her skin is not punctured. She doesn't wind up claiming the serpent at this point, but she can have contact with it. So, I think in a way, this dream says something about the dreamer's ego, and that there is a good, solid ego here that can serve the purpose that's fit for going forward with the journey, because the ego can be in relationship to the dog, the dreamer can be in relationship to the snakes, the dreamer can be in relationship to the psychopomp. So there's something about, and everything kind of is in its right place, and there's some good boundaries there. There's the psychopomp with the keys. There are these 6 compartments, each with a snake. So to her point about maybe dealing with codependency, I think this dream does point out that the ego now is able to hold things separate that need to be kept separate.
Yeah, and I think this is a real initiatory dream because there is a descent and an encounter and a return. And the fact that the snake is basically sort of nibbling her hand, one of the thoughts I have is that the thing that might have been feared as being dangerous and injurious is actually it's actually not so bad. It's not such a big deal.
Yeah, although she wasn't scared of snakes to begin with. But Deb, I really like that framing it as an initiation, because it's absolutely true. There's an elder, there's a descent, there's an encounter, and then there's a return with renewed connection to the dog. You're absolutely right. That's perfect.
And that it doesn't have to be as dramatic, say, as Persephone's initiatory experience, the maiden that is abducted by Hades and spends time in the underworld while her mother, mourns and wreaks havoc upon the earth. And then Persephone returns and is reunited. It doesn't have to be quite as intense as that.
Well, so actually this little dream is the whole hero's journey, right, of Joseph Campbell.
Mm-hmm, there it is.
The encounter with the monster and the return with an integration, renewed integration. It's great, yeah.
That sounds like a lovely lysis to end with.
Yes.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.